Carolyn Lederer. I'm a faculty member in the sociology department and also a professor of labor research here. And it is my honor to introduce tonight's colloquium speaker. She is Caroline Fredrickson, who is a lawyer and an author, who currently is president of the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy in Washington, D.C. In her distinguished career, Fredrickson previously served as director of ACLU's Washington Legislative Office. She was general counsel and legal director of NARAL, Pro-Choice America. In addition, she was chief of staff to Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington and deputy chief of staff to former Senate Democratic leader Tom Daschle. During the Clinton administration, and that would be the Bill Clinton administration, she served as special assistant to the president for legislative affairs. Caroline Fredrickson graduated summa cum laude from Yale University with a BA in Russian and East European Studies. And then she graduated from Columbia University School of Law with a JD degree. At Columbia, she was a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar. She served on the Columbian Law Review, and she co-founded the Columbia Journal of Gender and Law. And if you want to look at something pretty impressive, take a look at that journal. Tonight's lecture is also the Gender and Women's Studies program's annual Carlson lecture, so I'll just say a few words about that. In 1988, Eleanor Carlson pledged a gift of $1 million to the University of Rhode Island's Women's Studies program, which is today the Gender and Women's Studies program. Her wish was to make a gift that will advance the status of women through educational opportunities and advance the field of women's studies at URI. Her gift became an endowed chair, a lecture series, and scholarships for students. The aim of the Carlson Lecture is to bring distinguished scholars in the field of women's studies to URI. Since the establishment of her gift, the annual lecture has brought to campus numerous distinguished scholars, reaching an audience of more than 5,000 people. The Carlson Scholarships have awarded more than 50 full tuition scholarships. So tonight, as part of the theme of inequality and the American dream, Caroline Fredrickson will speak to us about gender inequality. Not so much about the recent attempts to reestablish patriarchal values that have no place in postmodern ethos that gave rise to both this colloquium series as well as the first female presidential candidate in U.S. history. Not about those patriarchal apologists who are attempting to resurrect the entirement of locker room talk that condones the rape culture we are trying to eradicate from our campuses and from society. That's just too obvious to discuss tonight. Rather, Caroline Fredrickson will talk to us tonight about structured gender inequality that intersects with race, education, income, and citizenship. Inequality that is embedded in laws otherwise designed to protect workers. These laws, which recognize the need and support the ability of employees to be good workers and good caregivers simultaneously, exempt some categories of workers in systematic and deliberate ways. Her work powerfully calls us to action, to address the reality that caregiving work, mostly performed by women, is seriously undervalued, not just culturally, but undervalued in the structure of social and workplace protection laws. She also documents trends that are weakening the power of these laws for all workers and makes the case that paid leave, equal pay, and other workplace protections are human rights. It's impossible to read her writing and know her work and not feel compelled to act. Her recent book, Under the Bus, directly reflects the mission of her organization, the American Constitution Society, that law can and should be a force for improving the lives of all people. So please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Caroline Fredrickson.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I must say, those of you who give public talks and you have somebody introduce you probably go through this every time. I always feel sort of embarrassed, and reminds me of once upon a time when I was working for Senator Daschle. I happened to be with him in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, in the airport, and for a variety of reasons, including that my grandmother lived in Sioux Falls, my parents happened to be in the airport at exactly the same time. Now, I hadn't told my grandmother that I was going to be there, so my bad. I was just in and out for the day, but so I introduced my parents to Senator Daschle, and my father started telling Senator Daschle what my SAT scores were. And it was the most humiliating moment of my life, but I always feel a little bit like that. But anyway, thank you. It was a very, very lovely introduction. I'm so, so grateful to be here with all of you. Here at URI, which is a marvelous institution, and I really admire what you've done in putting together this colloquium. I'm again very honored to be among the speakers that you have. It's quite a wonderful lineup. So I want to thank the Colloquium Committee for putting this together, for inviting me, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. So, I'm going to say this is, for some of you in the room, this may remind you of something you've done fairly recently, but for me this was quite some time ago. But I kind of came to one of the stories that brought me into writing my book involved my great-grandmother. And when I was applying to college, which I said for me was quite some time ago, for some of you it was pretty recently, and I thought, well, my great-grandmother, it's a great story. I'm going to write about her for my college essay. And I thought, at the time, it was this very romantic story. So her name was Matilda Olofsson. I'm half Swedish, maybe not that surprising to you with a name like Fredrickson. So there was Miss Matilda Olofsson. She was very poor. She was very poor, end of the 19th century, the oldest child. Her mother died. She was helping her father by caring for all the younger children. The younger children all got sick, and it's not a romantic story, it's a really sad story. They died, and her father said to her, there's nothing left for you here. So at 18, she went off to America. She got in a boat, and steerage, bottom of the boat, all the people who can't afford to have a nice cabin, and she came to Boston all by herself. She spoke no English. She got a job as a scullery maid, and so, at the time, that I was hearing this story, it seemed to me, I thought it was kind of romantic because my family was watching a show that some of you will never have heard of, but some of you may have, called Upstairs, Downstairs. And so I knew what the downstairs was. And Matilda Olofsson was doing the job of the lowest of the low. She had a hard life. She had really hard work. She actually was forced to eat the scraps from the plates that came downstairs from the dining room. She didn't have any legal rights. She was subject to all sorts of abuses. So, but I thought, when I was applying to college, look at this incredible story. She came. It's so long ago. Isn't it interesting? Wasn't she a hero? And then, I thought, I started thinking about writing this book, and this only is something I've learned fairly recently, that this isn't actually something that doesn't happen anymore. Upstairs, Downstairs has been replaced by Down Abbey. Down Abbey. So I, learned about women like Sonia Suarez, who live in Boston today. Sonia Suarez is also a domestic worker, She works 14-hour days or more. She faced sexual harassment in the workplace, physical abuses, wage theft. Her employers would not let her take a day off when she was sick so she could go see a doctor. She had no right to be paid overtime when she worked those 14-hour days. And so as I started digging into what goes on with these kinds of workers today, I myself was shocked to find out that well over 100 years later, after Matilda Olofsson came to this country, women doing similar jobs today have little more protection than did Matilda at the end of the 19th century. And I want to point out that my friend Eric Loomis, who's here, has a book called Out of Sight, and we sort of bonded over this because Eric's book also looks at sort of examples of places where we've established some workers' rights in this country, but others have been overlooked. But so, one of the things that really jumped out to me was that I was a labor lawyer. I did employment and labor law. Before I went to work for Senator Daschle, I practiced union-side labor law, and I did employment and labor policy on the Hill, and I didn't know that these groups of workers were left out because I was looking at the legislation and I just failed to read or consider or think about when it said in these statutes, except for the following. So, few people really, including me, know that as we adopted progressive laws to improve the wages and working conditions of so many, we actually left many people behind. Pervasive ideas about race, women, and work played an enormous role in shaping and limiting what work could actually be considered worthy of protection. So during the New Deal, when President Roosevelt, who actually, he did so much, the legislation he worked to put through Congress was very important. But he had to bargain with members of Congress, particularly with the Dixiecrats, who were mostly Democrats from the South, who forced him to trade the rights of certain people of color and women to get enough votes to pass those bills that provided minimum wage and overtime and the right to join a union. Did I just do that? I'm sorry. I turned off the screen, I think. Well, we'll live without that. So let me just give you, this is one, one of the things that my research did, besides teaching me that I hadn't paid enough attention to the and who's left out of the legislation, was that as I started looking into the congressional record, it's so much more explicit than we can even imagine. I guess it's not surprising, really, when we think about the historical context, but I started reading some of the comments about that were during the debates on the legislation. And there was a senator whose nickname was Cotton. And you'll see that as I go through my talk that cotton is unfortunately a very strong theme and not a positive one in this story. So there's Cotton Ed Smith, a senator from South Carolina. He was, to say the least, a virulent racist. And he was complaining how terrible it was, the changes that had come to the South after the Civil War ended slavery, and African Americans won the right to vote and to equal protection of the laws. And he was complaining. And first he complained about the anti-lynching law, really. The anti-lynching law. He complained about the 2/3 rule. This was a rule by which the Democratic Convention used to be subject to a supermajority by the Southern delegates so that they could protect their racist interests. So the Democratic Convention rule had been changed. They complained about that. And then he said, and last of all, this unconscionable, I shall not attempt to use the proper adjective to designate, in my opinion, this bill. He's talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act. He says, any man on this floor who has sense enough to read the English language knows that the main object of this bill, remember, this is to provide minimum wage and overtime. The main object of this bill is by human legislation to overcome the splendid gifts of God to the South. So that's what President Roosevelt was dealing with. And unfortunately, they left people out of the legislation, and we can all guess very obviously who that was. And part of it was there was a belief that so-called women's work, which consisted of caregiving, housekeeping, and particularly in the South on these plantations, picking cotton, was a natural role for women, and that helped justify legislation that gave rights only to those engaged in real work, who happened to be mostly white men. And with much of the work in the home having been done in the South by African American women, it was particularly valued as a legacy of slavery and racial oppression. Domestic labor, according to scholars, was actually known as niggers' work. And the mammy image, which was a large maternal figure with a headscarf and almost always a wide-toothed grin, persists as one of the most enduring racial caricatures of African American women. The National Labor Relations Act suffered from the same kinds of exclusions. In 1935, Congress adopted the National Labor Relations Act, which gave people the right to join unions and organize. It was designed to help pull the United States out of the Great Depression, to create a more level playing field for workers and ultimately higher wages. But once again, the Dixiecrats demanded their concessions. They were meant to leave in place the legacy of Jim Crow and to allow them to continue to mistreat black workers as a condition for their votes. And the racist Southern congressman won, and to this day, both agricultural and domestic workers do not have the right to organize, except in certain states. That's farm workers alone in California. So what this has meant for these domestic workers, who are primarily women, is that they have been denied almost all of the fruits of the New Deal. Other exclusions affected laundry workers. Why? Because at the time they were Chinese Americans. Hospital workers. Why? Because they were primarily women of color. And so on. And later on, though, the racist and misogynist tendencies became a little more subtle. You know, they got to a place where they realized out-and-out direct exclusions. And let me just tell you, they were really direct. I read you that quote from the congressional record, but there was more than that. In the Social Security Act debates, somebody actually said, couldn't we just cut out black people? Literally. Someone said, you know, that might violate the 14th Amendment. They said, okay, so what jobs do they do? Okay, all right, domestic workers, farm workers, we'll just cut them out instead. So I keep thinking, you know, constitutional law is something I'm interested in. Why didn't anybody ever bring a constitutional challenge to that? But later on, they had to become more subtle, more nuanced in how these exclusions worked. So as we moved into the era where Congress was adopting civil rights legislation, and then later on family leave, Affordable Care Act, the exclusion started to focus on the size of the company. But the origins of that exclusion was in reality, came out of the same impulses of racism and misogyny. But it was just better hidden in neutral language. So let me get to read you a little bit from the congressional record from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where the exclusion was framed in light of how hard it would be for small business to have to be subject to people in their business who were different from them. And, you know, the members talked about all these, you know, sort of this beautiful personal relationships that happened in these firms. And so there was a Senator Cotton. As I said, Cotton is a strong theme here. And this Senator Cotton wasn't his nickname, it was actually his name. And he was very sentimental, and he talked about, you know, when a small businessman selects an employee, he comes very close to selecting a partner. And when he selects a partner, he comes very dangerously close to the situation he faces when he selects a wife. So this is a time now, for those of you who are not versed in your constitutional law, there was an important decision in American history called Loving versus Virginia, which found it unconstitutional to prevent people from different races from marrying. This conversation was before that time, and it was very clear to people in this debate what they were talking about. Senator Mondale from Minnesota called them out on it. The only reason that we're doing this is because you don't want to mix primarily with African Americans. But the problem with what happened is that this size-based exclusion, that certain laws only apply to companies bigger than a certain size, meant that we gave some kind of a blessing to the smaller companies to engage in discrimination. And it's also created a perverse incentive for companies to try and be small, and that might be through outsourcing or hiring temps, franchising, so that they remain small enough not to be subject to the law. And then lastly, related to that, is that the protections that we've created in this country for workers tend to depend on their being employees, right? And so why that's important is because all of the things that we associate with our workplace protections are not available to those workers who are considered contractors, who are temps, are somehow outside the traditional employment relationship. So, a lot of you have probably heard about what's going on with Uber, right? You know the story. Are Uber drivers? Are they employees or are they contractors? Well, it's in the news now because we all have our iPhone and we have an app. And that's, we mediate our driving through that. But let me tell you that the low-wage women workforce has been subject to the outsourcing and contracting for decades. I'm glad that we're having this discussion because I can hope we can bring it back to the discussion of those women who are cleaning houses and working as janitors and have not been given the benefits of being an employee. And that is what I mean by benefit of an employee: minimum wage, overtime, civil rights protections, family leave, pensions, and so forth. So this whole situation that we've created, which allows employers to wriggle out of providing benefits to employees by either outsourcing or designating certain employees as contractors, has created a workforce that has well more than two tiers. But I can assure you that the people on the bottom tend to be low-wage women of color. So, this is why, the other thing that happened that sort of encouraged me or maybe drove me to write this book was that at a certain point of time, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of people talking about leaning in and, sort of what women should do for themselves. Well, women have to speak up and women have to be stronger. And I don't disagree. I think there are a lot of cultural issues that women internalize that we could learn to be better about dealing with and being transparent and being braver. But, I don't think it's women's fault. I mean, I'm not saying Sheryl Sandberg did either, but I don't think leaning in is really enough because it doesn't address the real issues that most women face. And one of the things that happened when I was doing my research was I was talking to women who work as nannies. And you sort of think, well, gosh, what happens to you if you have to stay late watching other people's kids? Who's there for your kids? And so I decided I had to write a book. Because one of the things I think is really important is that in addition to whatever we do for ourselves, we really need structural change. Self-help is just not enough. So that's why in Under the Bus, I wanted to show how labor and employment laws either directly or indirectly exclude many marginalized women because they work in small companies, because they're home health aides, they're farm workers, they're nannies, they're independent contractors, or they're in other positions that fall outside the legal definition of employee. And we have done very little to address that. These women are routinely denied the minimum wage, family leave, health care, the right to unionize, and overtime. They're subject to wage theft, harassment, and discrimination, most of it within the bounds of the law. So I want to talk a little bit about issues that are treated outside of this context, are often in the news, and put them in this context so you see how that actually plays out in real women's lives. So wages, right? I think there's fairly well known that women make somewhere between 77 and 80% of men's wages on average. African American women only 63%, Latinas only 54%. So they're terrible numbers. So where does that come from? What we don't often talk about is why. What are the reasons? So when you sort of pick it apart, economists will say about half of the wage gap is occupational segregation. That is, women go into professions that are dominated by women, they pay lower wages. So I actually think, well, why do positions that are dominated by women pay lower wages? Isn't that discrimination anyway? But even if you were to say somehow women's choices determine, they decide, pay me less. That sounds great. I'm going to go for that job. So anyway, economists, some of them think that that's just a choice women make. Okay, so that's about half of the wage gap. But the other piece is when we talk about the minimum wage, we rarely talk about the fact that 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. So when we're talking about raising the minimum wage, the major beneficiaries of a higher minimum wage are actually women. And it's even more so when we look at the tipped minimum wage. So y'all may know that when you go to a restaurant, that the waiter who serves you is getting a tip, right? Do you know that that person gets paid well below the minimum wage? Now, there are 7 states that have done away with the sub-minimum wage. Unfortunately, Rhode Island is not one of them. The national level for the sub-minimum wage is $2.13. I mean, come on. $2.13 is shocking. Shocking. Now, you're a little better here. It's $2.89, I believe, in Rhode Island. But really, think about it when you go to a restaurant the next time. And tip well. Because unfortunately, the theory is that the employer, the restaurant, is supposed to fill in. If the worker doesn't get the full minimum wage on their shift, but that is virtually impossible to enforce. I'd say, come and hear your next speaker, Saru Jayaraman, because she is an expert on this topic, and it's incredibly important because 3/4 of the tipped workers are women, and a very high percentage of those women are women with children. So then that leaves unexplained 40% of the wage gap. So what could it be? How about discrimination? Women are making less money because they're women, and employers think they can exploit that. Part of it is that we have very, very weak enforcement of our civil rights protections. But part of that is that there is this large group of women, as I mentioned, independent contractors, people who work in companies that are smaller than 15 employees, that's the civil rights laws, temp workers and so forth, who just actually aren't covered by the civil rights laws, so they have no legal remedy at all. And so in allowing some business owners to discriminate, our laws actually open the doors to a sexualized, racialized, and oppressive working environment. And, I actually am going to circle back to the topic you mentioned that I wasn't going to talk about. But so to say, along with, as I mentioned, sexualized, along with paying women less because they are women, the exclusion from the civil rights laws actually allows sexual harassment to be even more pervasive than it is. And sexual harassment, as is obvious, leads to loss of wages, job turnover, higher absenteeism, reduced job satisfaction, lower productivity, and adverse health outcomes. And that's for women who are actually protected by our civil rights laws. So let's just imagine that these marginalized low-wage women suffer even more. So along these lines, I wanted to mention something an exclusion that is somewhat of a new phenomenon, a creative contracting by employers, which is just to contract out of our civil rights, employment, and labor protections. So for those of you who are watching the news, you may have noticed there was a lot of attention on Gretchen Carlson, who was at Fox News, who has been suing Roger Ailes, who was the chairman of Fox, for sexual harassment, demanding sexual favors from her. When she refused, she was fired. And they tried to squelch her lawsuit by saying, well, you signed an arbitration clause in your contract, and therefore you have no right to go to court at all. And this may be news to you, but as you younger people, pay attention to this, because, unfortunately, this is a direction that more and more employers are going, which is to force you in your employment contract to sign away your right to actually protect your rights. No longer would you be able to go to court if you've been discriminated against in any way, and you're forced into arbitration. And the thing about arbitration is that arbitrators are hired by the employer. They want to be rehired by the employer. Their decisions don't set precedents. They're not public. You can't appeal it. And if the employer decides that they want to arbitrate the case and it's in the other side of the country, you got to go there and you got to pay your own way. So let me read you a story about how this can play out. You might have all heard of the company American Apparel. So the women employees' experience there really provide an extreme example of the danger of arbitration clauses. The chief executive, Dov Charney, was a serial sexual harasser who was able to cover up his misbehavior for a decade because his staff had all signed agreements not to sue, keeping it a secret from the public, from investors, from his board, and preventing these women from having any real remedy. But multiple women had brought suit challenging the arbitration clauses as biased towards the company, but almost all of them lost until one woman, including one woman who said that she'd been forced to be Dov Charney's sex slave. So a New York Times reporter who was writing for the business section asked, if American Apparel and Mr. Charney had been subject to public lawsuits, how long could Mr. Charney have lasted? There were 5 suits in the space of a few months in 2011 alone, and those are the claims we know about. Dov Charney was a CEO who bragged to a reporter that masturbation in front of women is underrated. So, sounds familiar, doesn't it? Very, very of the moment. So the other place where these women are excluded, as I mentioned, was from the National Labor Relations Act. A lot of categories of workers are forbidden from joining unions, but what's particularly significant for low-wage women workers, because unions have done more to address the wage gap than anywhere else. And in fact, the public sector unions, public sector employees, have the lowest wage gap of any place in our economy. And so for all of us, the shrinking of the labor movement has meant that wages are stagnant and inequality is growing. But it's particularly problematic for women and people of color because they have done much to address the gap, and there's little help from that sector right now. But so, as I said, there are a variety of issues that get affected by these exclusions. In addition to wages, the issue of hours is often under discussion now. And we have a very laissez-faire approach to scheduling, right? It's pretty much in the hands of the employer. For a lot of women, that means too many hours. They have to work too many hours. For some women, it means they don't have enough hours. And for quite a number of women, it means that their hours are just completely unpredictable. So, for working mothers, this is incredibly complicated. So let me circle back to those women I said were excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act. Those, particularly the home care workers, domestic workers, who do not get covered by overtime are often the most subject to working way too many hours. Why? Because who would you pick to have work 80 hours? The one you have to pay overtime to, or the one you don't have to pay overtime to? It's probably the one you don't have to pay overtime to. So the examples are really poignant, but I heard from a home health worker who did talk about working over 80 hours a week. She was paid $10 an hour. She got no cost coverage for her travel time between patients. She couldn't get her gas paid by the employer. Sometimes she'd have to stay overnight. And then they said that that's not really, that's not health care, that's companion care. So otherwise known as babysitting. So they actually reduced her wages to minimum wage. Farm workers also face this situation where they have no overtime. And thus, let me just remind you, for those of you who haven't spent, as much time sort of wrangling with the New Deal laws as I have, overtime was not meant to say, hey, workers, here's more money for you. That's not the point of overtime. Overtime was a concept that was meant to spread work around. So, during the Depression, there was a very high unemployment rate. So the overtime provision was actually meant to discourage employers from working people way too hard and encourage them to hire more people. So that has been unfortunately so exploited with these workers who don't get overtime because it leads to exactly the worries and the problems that were meant to be addressed by the Fair Labor Standards Act. So with the women who work too few, and they actually, let's just say they often don't work too few, they just work too few for one employer, because what we saw, particularly with the Great Recession that we just went through, was that a lot of employers started moving more and more of their people into, and particularly women, into part-time jobs. Because in addition to only employees getting benefits, it's often only full-time employees who get benefits. And so, we've gone to a place where we have over 8 million involuntary part-time workers. And involuntary means this is what you get. They actually want a full-time job, but they can't get one. But we also hear that Americans work a lot of hours. And so how do we square these two statistics? Well, they're both true, it's just that they're not at one job. These involuntary part-time workers, the ones that are women, are working 2 or even 3 jobs. Women are the most likely workers to have 2 or 3 jobs. They're also the most likely workers to be responsible for child care. In other industries, in retail and in the restaurant industry particularly, there's been a whole new phenomenon which sort of combines some of this, trying not to have full-time workers, trying not to pay overtime. And they've sort of gotten rid of regular schedules altogether. So some of you may have heard of this. It's often called just-in-time or on-demand. And so, at a certain point, somebody thought, wow, we've learned to make cars in such a way that the widgets and the what's-its, only come in when we need them. And so they're we order them as we're building the car, and wouldn't it be neat, and wouldn't we save a lot of money if we could do that with our workers? And so, they have these these consultants who help design scheduling software that, as they said, would optimize worker flow. Sounds very ominous, doesn't it? Well, it is kind of ominous, because what it means is that somehow we've made a science out of deciding exactly how many workers we need at any particular store at any particular hour, and how many waiters you need at a particular restaurant, and thus the workers often have to call in every single day. Am I on? Am I not on? Am I on? Am I not on? Which means, do I have to get childcare? Do I not have to get childcare? Am I going to earn enough money this week? Can I actually pay my rent? Yes, no, a constant a constant uncertainty in life. And for people who are trying to stay above water financially, it's devastating. And so, I was reading this story No, this was, it was about a good employer, right, ultimately, because it was about Victoria's Secret. So Victoria's Secret is one of the many retail companies that had been using this kind of scheduling. And they announced a year or so ago that they were going to get rid of, partly because their workers were, were organizing. So, you know, that's one strategy to improve your workplace is organize. But so as a response, Victoria's Secret said, okay, we're going to get rid of this on-demand scheduling. And I just started thinking, okay, how could really Victoria's Secret optimize worker flow? It's like Tuesday's thong day. We need more workers on Tuesday because thongs go fast on Tuesday. We have lingerie Thursdays. But Wednesdays are really, nobody buys underwear on Thursday or Wednesdays, so, we don't need as many workers. I mean, really, come on, let's call it what it is, which was a way of extracting profits on the back of workers. So, on top of all of the sort of this, the way that the kind of wages and hours work, the lack of protections that we have for many workers, we also have to confront the fact that we do a very bad job in this country in addressing the economics of families. So, on top of the forced overtime that workers, home care workers, let me just say, fastest growing profession in the country, workers like that, forced overtime, the chaotic schedules, the part-time, the lack of protections from the civil rights laws. We don't do very much on the family side. We have a very flimsy family leave policy. We have an abysmal lack of child care. Let me just say, 2016, some people in government have got to realize that the women are actually working. Hello, reality check, women work, people have families. This is an area that we actually really need to step up, and I'm glad you have some of your professors here are doing amazing work on family leave. Let me just say, so for those of you who not that familiar with the Family and Medical Leave Act, it was adopted by Congress in 1993. But it's one of those laws that I said, it's a good idea generally. It was meant to provide at least the protections for some workers to take time off to care for a newborn child or an adoption or other family medical issue. But it is one of those that excludes so many because of the way it's structured. So it gives 12 weeks of unpaid leave, but only for an actually fairly small number of employees. So first of all, you have to be an employee, so no contractors, no temps, and it has to be, your company has to have over 50 employees, and your employee must have worked at least 1,250 hours the previous year. So that already, of even the category of workers that are employees, it excludes 40% of private sector workers, and particularly excludes the workers who are those most in need, younger, low-wage women of color. And because the Family and Medical Leave Act is unpaid, many parents, and particularly women who qualify, often have to opt out because they just can't afford to lose those wages. So I would have to call out Rhode Island for being so much better than most of the rest of the country because you actually have paid leave. Because paid leave is what we need in this country. Because when you don't have paid leave, and women, and this is, as I said, it's particularly true for low-wage women who just don't have the margin, who don't have the financial cushion to say, I can just spend a couple weeks and have no pay. Instead, what they do is they have their child and they go right back to work. And so, there have been extensive studies documenting how many of these women go back after hemorrhaging, with postpartum depression, with other illness. And it's not just the mothers who need this time. It's also the babies. Babies who don't have their mother there right away are much less likely to be vaccinated, to see a doctor, and mothers have a harder time breastfeeding. So there's questions. There are issues that affect all of us because we have such blindness about the kinds of policies that we need. Now, so the obvious answer is, why don't we have paid family leave? Only 11% of the workforce in the United States has paid leave. 89% you're on your own financially. And that is, again, only if you actually have the right to take leave. If you're an employee at a company with more than 50 employees and you've worked 1,250 hours. So we are sitting on a situation where the vast majority of our population does not have a paid leave policy. And of course, you know, those most likely to have the leave, be eligible for both paid and unpaid leave, are likely to be men. And also, probably not surprisingly, they're also the least likely to take it because we still have social stigma about stay-at-home dads, even dads who take time off for family leave. Now, so, you know, this was one of the interesting things that I discovered when I was doing research, was that, you know, there have been a lot of international studies looking at which countries have the most robust family policies, and not surprisingly, we all know about Scandinavia, which has changed a lot since Matilda Olofsson came to this country. But on paid leave, you know, so I discovered that at the time I was doing my research, there were only 4 countries in the world that had no form of paid leave at all at the national level. 4 countries: Papua New Guinea, Lesotho, and Swaziland, and the United States of America. One of these things does not belong. Okay, well, if you said Swaziland, you'd be right, because Swaziland moved ahead and adopted some, you know, form of family leave, so now it leaves the United States, Papua New Guinea, and Lesotho. Well, I am sorry, we're a lot richer than they are, and I would hope that we could do better. So you're taking the lead. I look to you to help that happen. So in addition to child care, to family leave, on the family policy side, there's a child care gap. And this is true for families across the board income-wise. You know, again, we've pretty much structured our child care system, you know, on this mythology of the Leave It to Beaver family, father responsible as being the breadwinner, mother stays home to care for children. And thus, we haven't really adopted or adapted our child care policies to reflect the fact that, you know, as I said, reality check, women are working. You know, for some of you, and actually for me too, at the time when I was doing my research, this may come as a huge surprise, but there was a time in history when Congress actually passed laws that were good. So, you know, as I said, it's surprising. Sometimes, you know, you do historical research and you find things that you never knew were possible. So, Congress in the 70s, when President Nixon was in office, Congress actually decided that it was time to pass the universal child care legislation. Congress did pass universal child care legislation. So, kind of amazing. So, where did it go, you ask? Why don't we have universal child care? And I say, well, okay, unfortunately, there was a woman named Phyllis Schlafly. Some of you may have heard of her. So Phyllis Schlafly, she was a leader of the group that fought the Equal Rights Amendment, and I guess she didn't know what to do with herself after her huge victory. And so, you know, she saw that this legislation had moved forward, and she organized her troops. And, you know, she was out there describing, you know, how horrible this would be for the United States. I mean, the United States is going to come to an end, right? I mean, the world will collapse if we have this child care. And this is a quote from her, actually. She says, "We realized that if we didn't get out and defend our values, this little feminist pressure group," and I guess she was talking about Congress at the time because they had passed a law, but, you know, this little feminist pressure group was going to end up changing our schools, our laws, our textbooks, our Constitution, our military, everything, and end up taking our husbands' jobs away. Wow, okay, so, you know, communism was going to come to the United States, and, you know, whatever, you know. And so she had this vision of this family that she thought we needed to enshrine and protect. And so she prevailed probably not, it wasn't that hard, President Nixon, but they prevailed on President Nixon, and he vetoed the legislation. So that's where it ended up. Now let me tell you what this means for parents, for single moms in particular. Let me tell you another story. So this is a woman in Arizona. Her name was Alexandria Wallace. She's fairly typical of the situation. She, single mom, as I said, she could not afford child care. Well, let me just say, for those of you who are young enough and you may be contemplating someday having a child, I'll just let you know. So the average cost for child care in this country is the same as in-state college tuition. So for those of you who are in-state, in Rhode Island, you might think about what you're paying for tuition, and you might start trying to figure out how to save enough so that you can pay for someone to go to your 1-year-old or your 2-year-old to be in child care. So start saving now. And it ain't cheap. So she could not afford to put her 3-year-old in child care, but she was working in a hair salon. And so, like a lot of women in this situation, they have sort of flexible arrangements with friends and family and would watch, somebody would watch your kid and then, you'd watch their kid, and that often worked, but it didn't always work. And so she had to skip one too many shifts at her salon, and she got fired. Now, the upside of this, she had no income, so that's normally a downside, but in the context of child care, it was an upside, because she now was eligible to enroll her child in the state's subsidized child care. Now, unfortunately, what happened in Arizona, which also is pretty true everywhere else in America, is that we may have this theoretical subsidized child care program, but we, haven't actually funded it. So in Arizona, they cut almost all the funding for the program. So she went to sign up, and they said, yeah, okay, so your child will be number 11,001 in line for the next open slot. So, come back when she's 35, and maybe we'll have a place for her. So this is the sad story of child care in America. 77% of all women with children under 18 are working in this country, and 2/3 of women with children under 6. So child care is an absolute necessity in this country. So now I'm just going to, I don't want to leave you all depressed, right? It's not all bad news. But I do think it's important in the context of inequality in the American dream, which is what I'm so glad that you're focusing on, is that we really, in order to get the American dream, to have it be real for people, we actually have to address inequality. We've had activists who've been focused on Wall Street, which I think is important, but Main Street, where people are working, and K Street, where lobbyists in D.C., you may have heard of it, are congregating, they need to be the attention of activists as well. Because we need our groups that are focused on economic disparities and who are challenging our acceptance of rising inequality in America to meet with feminists to demand an end of policies and practices that disadvantage women. Because, reality check is women work. Women are the economy. And if we care about inequality, they are at the center of that debate. And particularly at a time when we are a nation in the midst of an amazing change, with demographic diversity growing, and where women, from the most impoverished to the middle class and above, are working in high percentages, and where more and more workers are falling into this legal wasteland of limited rights and contingent employment relationships. The safety net that we had sort of been proud of, although never that proud, because it always could have been better, but it's really now it's like a sieve. And more people are slipping through. Something we need to address when we need to reweave so that it will actually catch more people when they fall. But as I said, I am hopeful because otherwise I wouldn't be in the business that I'm in, really. How can you spend all this time in D.C. and not be sort of hopeful? Because otherwise I'd rather live in Rhode Island. I'd still rather live in Rhode Island, but you know, one has to hope when you're in the business of social change. You have to continue to believe that there is a possibility to achieve some of it. And I do see that happening. I look at polling, and I look at legislative victories that are actually happening. Like in Rhode Island, where you have paid family leave. In other places, like Minneapolis, where they were working on legislation to address scheduling, to give workers some control over their lives, where states have passed higher minimum wages above the federal level, where the Department of Labor has announced new federal rules on pay transparency, because there is one of the most important things to enable women and people of color to get at the issue of the pay gap is actually to know how you're paid relative to the other workers. There's no other way to get at it until you actually have the data. The federal government has also issued new rules for sick pay for federal contractors. And Sonia Suarez, who is, like my great-grandmother Matilda, is a domestic worker in Boston. She now actually is entitled to the minimum wage and overtime because this Department of Labor finally fixed the regulations that had carved the domestic workers out of that law since the 30s. There have been other advances, and there will be more advances. So it's what I ask of all of you is to join me in thinking and moving forward on a new paradigm, where leaning in really means leaning together, and where we recognize that we can only grow stronger together. So I'll leave you with that and look forward to working with all of you to get at the American dream by addressing issues of inequality in America. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions, so if you have a question, please raise your hand, and Professor Johnson and I will come around.
And Katie, I'm sorry, it's going to turn the screen off.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was great. I have a fairly daring question to ask here. So, so I'm wondering how you didn't mention anything about adjuncts. Teachers at universities. So that's a very dangerous topic here. So I'm wondering, do you see adjuncts as a phenomenon of what you would call scheduling flow? Do you see adjuncts as an aspect of contracting out? And I'm wondering, for me, I guess I'm an idealist. I just can't understand why, when people in institutions see horrific inequality, that they don't just rectify it, why they don't take it upon themselves. Can you help me understand why that doesn't happen?
Well, that's a hard. I'll start with the adjunct part of it. So, interestingly enough, I just published an article actually it was this year, on adjuncts. I'm very interested in the topic. I don't think I mentioned this group. My parents were both professors, and my mother actually sort of functioned in that role. My father got tenure first, and she finished her dissertation when I was just a little girl. I have 3 older siblings, so she was quite behind him in sort of, getting through. And so, that's sort of the standard way at the time. That adjuncting happened was sort of the housewife job. It was the place you could park the wife, and you really need to do that much more because you got the husband, he's got tenure, and that's all fine. Well, so there was a time when my father when he was tenured, it was about 75% of the teaching was done by tenure or tenure-track faculty. And the time now, that's pretty much reversed itself. About 25% of the teaching is done by tenured and tenure-track faculty, and 75% is done by adjuncts. And so, as I think, I won't say causation, but correlation. Many more women and people of color have moved into sort of the higher education profession. And there have been a lot of other tendencies, as I mentioned, with the sort of use of contracting out, and the sort of disaggregation of the employment relationship, which I think all of these forces have led to a situation where higher ed is now very reflective of kind of the forces of capitalism that we see in so many other sectors, even though we'd like to think that universities are somehow better than that. So is it a question of scheduling or contracting out? Yes. I think it's mostly a question of saving money and doing it on the backs of workers. And I think one of the things, and again, correlation, not causation, but so there's been this. You all are probably very well aware of this, right? That really a high increase in tuition costs. Tuition's gone way up. How can that be when teaching is done mostly by adjuncts? So where's the money going? What is it paying for if it's not paying for teaching? And I've actually seen, if you actually look at, particular typical class, and you think, here's the student paying, X tens of thousands of dollars, and here's what the adjunct is paid. If you actually, dollar it out, it's like not minimum wage. So, it's an interesting question. Some people would blame it on high administration salaries. Other people say that, that the investors, they're attracting people by, building new gymnasiums and having a nice golf course and all of these things. It's just not putting money into teaching. I think, it's got to have an impact on the students. I think adjuncts are fabulous. They can be fabulous teachers, but when they're teaching, and this was what happens in D.C., because I interviewed a lot of adjuncts. They often teach at 6 different schools in the D.C. area. If any of you have been in D.C. and you're trying driving around, let me just tell you, traffic is not good. So they're trying to get from place to place. I actually, there was an adjunct I talked to who worked out of her car, lived in her car. They have offices. So anyway, this is a long answer to your question, but I think it's very relevant to what I've been talking about, and I've been encouraged by the organizing that's now happening among adjuncts. Most of the schools in the D.C. area actually unionized the adjunct workforce. And I think we've got to be looking at what the quality of education is and giving adjuncts more resources to be able to actually focus on their students. So why aren't we doing more about it? I think we are. I think the fact that there's organizing going on is a reflection of the fact that we can do more. So if there's other questions? Must be. Provocative questions, please. Jokes, welcome.
Hi. I guess my question stems from a gender perspective that is adding women to the mix isn't enough to address structural issues. So having a potential female president or having women fill traditionally male roles isn't enough to address gender inequality. Like, all these laws are great, all of these small prescriptions are fine, but it's not enough to address structural change. So I'm wondering if you could address that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's exactly what I was trying to get across in my book, was that, I think role models are really important. I think it's really exciting to have a national party have a woman candidate. I think that's very exciting. I won't say more. My organization is a nonpartisan C3 under the tax code, so we don't endorse candidates. So, but it's been exciting to have a national candidate who is a woman. But it's not enough. It's not enough, and you actually have to have, because we can all have aspirations, and I could want to be an astronaut, but I'm not going to be an astronaut just because I want to be. I actually have to be thinking about what enables people who come from marginalized communities and from women, who may not have either the opportunities to experience the types of to have the kinds of experiences that will make them ready for that, or be told or treated like they're capable. So there's a lot that needs to be done that's both sort of providing opportunities, but also I think the cultural piece. As I said, this is where I don't disagree with Sheryl Sandberg, that that's a piece of some of it, and that, creating the right, giving, women a sense of themselves as powerful, although that, sometimes when women are powerful, that gets thrown back in their face. But learning as a society how to accept that. But then we actually have to make structural changes, and that's about actually addressing the real impediments that inhibit women. I think women and men should be able to have families if they want to, and they shouldn't have to choose between their job, being a good employee or worker, and being a good parent. And right now we have a situation where often maybe one parent can be the good worker and the other one can be the good parent, or neither can do either, which is typical. So I think this is also really important for men to have a wider range of possibilities for who you can be. That our vision of sort of gender becomes much more flexible about what are appropriate roles, and people will fit on a spectrum, and being able to do that without losing your job, I think, is really important.
All right, do we have any more questions? All right, well,
I know it's late, but come on.
Yeah, we're a little past 8.
Yeah, all tired?
So we'll wrap up now. Do we have one more question over there? Yeah, Kristen.
I'll be quick.
Run.
I've worn them out.
You mentioned the importance of structural changes. How do you see the possibility of Hillary Clinton as a supporter of the changes that you're looking for?
Okay, so I already gave my legal disclaimer, right? So I have to do that again. I'm such a lawyer, but well, I would just say that, I think just examining the platforms of the two candidates, that Hillary Clinton has been much more explicit in her addressing of issues around the need to provide workers with the ability to have families, much more detailed, and much more focused on the family as a whole. I think, so she has a history there. She's put a lot of thought into it. And I just have to say, I was when I was Senator Cantwell's chief of staff, she was elected to the Senate at the same time that Hillary Clinton was elected, and sort of the two new women senators. We spent a lot of time working with with Hillary Clinton's office, and so I've seen her sort of history there, and she's been there for a long time. So I haven't followed Donald Trump's engagement on family policies for until really recently. So let's just say I think there's a lot lacking in what he's put out, because it's very vague and it hasn't focused on the family policy. It's been more of a maternity policy, which I think is not a good direction to go in, because when policies are focused on the mother as opposed to the parent, it becomes a reason to discriminate against women, because all of a sudden women are going to be expected at a certain age, from a certain age, to be more likely to be the ones who are out of the workforce for a longer time and to take the leave, and so they're going to be a cost to the employer that's not seen in men. So I think it's actually can be a very negative. And it was when I was doing my research, I was looking at the German example. They had very, very robust, generous policies for women. They actually guaranteed women 3 years of job protection when they went out for maternity leave. And guess what? Nobody wants to hire women. You got to hold a job for 3 years was very damaging on the employment side. So it's actually, can be negative. So, little long-winded answer, but on the policy side, I do think there's a lot more content with one candidate over the other.
Thank you very much. So,
In a lot of areas. But
Caroline has graciously offered to do a book signing. The books of her book, Under the Bus, are available just outside here. And as she mentioned, she's doing our PR for us too. Saru Jayaraman will be here next week to talk about workplace inequality and especially getting rid of the tipped minimum wage and organizing restaurant workers. So again, let's just give one more round of applause for Caroline Fredrickson.